Okay. Good evening, everyone, wherever you are. And I hope if you're in lockdown, you're still having a good time taking care of your wildlife. So fortunately here on Kangaroo Island, we've been very fortunate and I can get out and do my work. So I hear somebody's talking in the background. Anyway, so it was quite difficult for me to decide exactly what to share with you this evening because I can talk about echidnas all day and all night. And I often do in workshops. So because most of you are wildlife carers, I decided that I should talk about some of the things that I think are really important about echidnas and what makes them so different. And also, I like to call them the echidna, the survivor. So I'll get into these different things throughout my talk. As you heard, I actually came in 1988 to work with tiger snakes and echidnas because I couldn't get a full postdoctoral grant to work with reptiles because I'm really from beginning a very reptile lover. So it's not only echidnas. I still work with tiger snakes and Rosenberg's goanna. So they all have great ecosystems here on Kangaroo Island, and it's really interesting to watch their interactions also within the environment, which is so important. Okay, so I think one of the very, very first things that I like to remind everyone is that echidnas are survivors. So the monotremes were around with the dinosaurs 120 million years ago, and we all know what happened to the dinosaurs. So we don't have any dinosaurs on the planet today, but we still have monotremes. So that makes monotremes the longest surviving mammals in the world, and that makes them already very, very different. So I probably don't need to remind any of you who the monotremes are, because of course, you know, the short-beaked echidna is the one that most of us would be working with here in Australia. Some of you might be working with platypus, and probably none of you have had the opportunity to work with long-beaked echidnas. They died off of mainland Australia 20,000 years ago. So I have had the opportunity to work in PNG with students and also get my hands literally on some long-beaked echidnas. And yeah, they are just as amazing as the short-beaked. Okay, so most of you out there have worked with some type of marsupial. And so for today, I'd like you to forget about everything there is to know about a marsupial. It doesn't matter if you've worked with a kangaroo, a wallaby, a wombat, you know, it could have even been a flying fox or something else, because we're going to concentrate on echidnas and why echidnas are so different. So first of all, I want you to look at, you know, this old diagram, two diagrams actually, of what we believe happened in evolution and when the monotremes evolved compared to the marsupials and the placentals. So you can see that monotremes evolved much, much earlier than marsupials or placentals, which of course is one reason why they are so different. So for the monotremes themselves, we've already said there's only three: the platypus, the short-beaked echidna, and the long-beaked echidna, but they go back to, who knows, was it a common ancestor or not? There's still a lot to learn. Of course, Australia is a huge continent, and not a lot of fossil finds have been out there. We do know that there were more than one monotreme, but when platypus and echidnas actually diverged from each other is still a question. So echidna is a different mammal. I'm going to point out a lot of reasons why they're different, which you might know, and then concentrate on a couple. Okay, so an echidna has a beak, unlike any other mammal, and it has that very tiny mouth opening. They have those extra bones in the shoulder girdle, and I will sort of talk about that. They have the mechanoreceptors in the feet, and a lot of people don't realize that echidnas are actually sensing vibration through their feet, which is one reason why they're so hard to find, but it also helps them find their food sources. Now, of course, echidnas also have no teat or no nipple, which makes them very different. They have no permanent pouch. They have no external genitals, so you cannot look at an echidna to tell if it's a male or a female. They have that special muscle layer called the panniculus carnosus, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And they have a low operative body temperature. They have a cloaca, which you would be familiar with, but they are the only mammal whose hind feet point backwards. Now, what I'm going to concentrate most on this evening is their low operative body temperature, because that's really, really important if you're going out to rescue an echidna, or if you're keeping an echidna for hand rearing. Okay, but first we're going to look at some of these things I just talked about. The skull. So echidnas have an amazing skull. Their beak is part of the bone structure, and what you see then underneath is actually the lower jaw. So echidnas do not have teeth. Platypus have a molar, but they lose that after they're juvenile. So echidnas have no teeth at all, and it's actually the rotation. You have to think about the rotation of those two tiny bones of the lower jaw that actually help the mouth open and close when the tongue is going in and out. You'll notice also that they have a very, very large brain cavity, and they are smart. They've outsmarted me a number of times. So won't go into too much of that, but their skull is basically very amazing. So just a couple photos of, what does it look like in our live echidna. Here you can see the very, very tiny mouth opening, and that the nares are actually located at the end of the beak. So you can also see that it's a little bit bulbous, and that's a very healthy echidna. This is where also they have a lot of blood vessels. So when the beak does get injured, there is a lot of blood loss, but that doesn't necessarily, is not necessarily a bad thing for the echidna. Also, there's a lot of issues of when the lower jaw might get cracked or broken, and again, we know that they can survive that actually pretty well. So the secret of eating with such a tiny mouth, well, most of you probably know about their long tongue. And that tongue can extrude up to 17 centimeters, and it can go in and out of the mouth up to 100 times a minute. So these are really interesting facts if you're talking to school groups, to ask them to try to stick their tongue out 100 times a minute. It's quite funny. So even though echidnas do not have teeth, if you've ever had the opportunity to do a dissection of an echidna, you'll find that on the upper part of the skull, they have this palate, and on the palate they have these tiny little studs, and they actually grind their food between the top of their tongue and the roof of their mouth. So they're grinding all their food before swallowing it. And what I have found, and I believe, is that this palate is actually the fingerprint for the echidna, because every one we've examined is very individual and very different. Okay, skeleton. If you've never actually seen a skeleton of the echidna, I'm just going to concentrate right now on the shoulder girdle. So if any of you have picked up an echidna and they've started to dig into the ground, you know it's almost impossible to move them. Well, they have these extra bones in their shoulder girdle, which gives them enormous strength for lifting. But then the bones themselves are actually quite extraordinary. But what they also have, both on their front and their back legs, they have a muscle structure like no other mammal has. So you know that both the front and the hind legs, first of all, they're very angular compared to a lot of our other mammals. And they have then this muscle construction that you can see here. And it's because of this mechanical advantage that they have that makes them tremendously strong, not only for lifting things, but also if you're trying to pick it up and they're digging in. Okay, so this is my survival triangle. And I think anytime you go to rescue or hand rear an animal, there's certain things you always need to think about. And so in my survival triangle, I have temperature, food, metabolism, and also social structure. So these are three things that probably you as wildlife carers, rehabilitators think about with any of the species that you're working with. But with echidnas, again, I think one of the most important things to remember is the temperature aspect of their life and how different they are. Okay, so when you have an animal that you're working with, usually I'm giving interactive talks, so I can't see you today, which is a pity, but I would ask you, what is the active body temperature of the species that you're working with? And you'll probably know that as a carer. You'll know what the active body temperature is, and you know why that body temperature is important and what you have to do to maintain body temperature. Now, with an echidna, it has a lower active body temperature than any other mammal. So their active body temperature is only 31 to 33 degrees. And how do they keep that low temperature? I mean, if you work with a lot of animals, you see that they either sweat, they pant, they lick themselves to stay cool. If you're working with a tortoise, he might actually pee on his hind legs. So echidnas can't do any of these. So I don't know if you've ever considered, how do echidnas actually keep cool and maintain that body temperature? Well, the first thing they do if you're in the wild is that they avoid the heat. And this is why you don't see a lot of echidnas out on very hot days, at least not out in the open. Some people ask, well, when can I see an echidna? And I always say, well, that depends on the time of day and the time of year, because echidnas do avoid the heat, but that doesn't mean that they're not active during the hot periods. What they're doing is going into places where it's quite comfortable for them. So here on Kangaroo Island, over the years, we've done a lot of measurements. We know that air temperature can be 38 degrees or higher. On the ground, in the sun, the temperature can be 60 degrees and higher. But when we measure the areas that the echidnas are active in, we find that in those areas, the temperature may only be 18 to a maximum of 20 degrees. So, you know, if you're out and want to find echidnas at certain times of the year, you have to consider, what is the weather, what is the habitat that I'm in, and where might I find an echidna? Okay, here on Kangaroo Island, we are surrounded by water, and echidnas are often seen down in tidal areas, such as here at Pelican Lagoon. And, you know, it's not unusual to actually see them in the water. In fact, from Echidna Watch across the nation, I get reports all the time of echidnas going swimming. Along the Great Ocean Road, people who've rescued echidnas a number of times because they were out in the surf, brought the echidna to the land, and what does the echidna do after a few minutes? It goes back out into the water again. So it's not unusual to see an echidna swimming, and yes, they can actually swim quite well. So, but if we think about temperature and other possibilities for the echidna to regulate its body temperature, we need then to look at the spines. So depending on what part of Australia you're living in, who I'm talking to, your echidna spines might look very different than these two pictures. The top one is a normal, typical Kangaroo Island echidna, Tachyglossus aculeatus, multiaculeatus, and you can see it has a lot of very long spines. The animal on the right-hand side is a Tasmanian echidna, and you can see that it's very, very furry. So I've seen a lot of echidnas from New South Wales and parts of Victoria where the spines are actually fairly short, stout, a lot stouter than the ones on Kangaroo Island. In any case, all of our echidnas have spines, and I believe that those spines play a very important role in temperature. The spines themselves are modified hairs. So what you're seeing in this photo, I can show this, is that the spines actually erupt through the skin and don't have a root yet. And as the spines grow, you can see that the root develops. And the root of an echidna spine can actually be a centimeter or larger. Depending, of course, you know, what spines across the body. You have the fine spines around the ears, towards the head, and the larger spines on the back. But every large spine is usually accompanied by quite a number of smaller spines. So why are the spines important? Well, the spines themselves go into this muscle layer that I talked about, the panniculus carnosus. That is a muscle layer that no other mammal in the world has. And those spines go deep into that muscle, which is very vascularized. So it has a lot of blood flow through it. So having worked with thousands of volunteers over the years, we had a volunteer here who actually helped develop some of the best car radiators in the world. And he was saying, look at the shape of the echidna spine. It's one of the best shapes in the world to actually distribute heat. So with the root of the spine in this muscle layer with all this blood flowing through it, that means that the echidna can possibly lose a lot of heat through the spine and help cool itself. Now, this is still a theory from me that I'm waiting for a student to figure out the technology to prove me right. But I do believe that that's very, very important. And we see that in a lot of different ways. Okay, what about the echidna body temperature itself? So here's a couple of graphs. The top graph you see is actually a 24-hour body temperature movement of 4 echidnas. Now, these echidnas have body temperature transmitters actually surgically implanted in the body. So this is not a cloacal temperature, it's the actual body temperature. And we say that echidnas are heterotherms. And what heterotherm means is that they have a variable body temperature, which you can see very much by this graph. The bottom graph shows a yearly cycle. So what it's showing in both the graph of 24 hours and the graph of a year is that the echidna lowers its body temperature, sometimes dramatically, and they use what we call torpor. So torpor is a daily event, and torpor is also a seasonal event. Okay, so torpor, you've probably heard of it, but as a biologist, we say it's an energy-saving mechanism. And so what happens during torpor is that the animal can lower its body temperature, lower its heart rate, lower its respiration, and of course then would also be lowering its metabolism. And it's quite easy to see that they can lower their temperature every day, which they do during their rest period. They just passively let their body temperature lower and come back up again. So this is something perhaps that isn't always considered when you're holding an echidna, that to have it in a natural temperature regime is probably the best opportunity for that animal. Okay, so they have the lowest active body temperature. And what I'm showing again in this top graph, it goes over 2 weeks and it shows body temperature fluctuation of an animal. And what you see, the light phase is during the day, the dark bars are at night. So you can see that every night the echidna let its body temperature go down. It raises again the next day, goes down again. And you can see on the bottom graph that it decided just to have a sleep for a couple of days. And that again is quite normal, and that can happen at any time of the year. So it's not necessarily dependent on weather. It can be dependent on food source availability. So this bottom graph, again, it's actually body temperature of two different animals over a little bit more than 24-hour period. So the one animal in blue, you can see that its body temperature was regulating up and down, up and down, up and down throughout the day, whereas the animal in red, well, it had been torpid at about 15 degrees. It raised its body temperature to the normal sort of 30, 31, and after a few hours, it decided to go into what we call deep sleep again. So it's not unusual for an echidna to do this. And what we say as physiologists is if you look at, okay, the blue was the air temperature. If you look at the width of the temperature variation in the echidna, we call that a safety margin. So the echidna has a very large safety margin when it comes to being able to adapt to different types of environments. All right, look at this poor little sod, 13 degrees. Now, a lot of people would say, oh, gee, I think this animal has had it. But no, this animal was simply torpid. And again, I'm just going to repeat, it is an energy-saving mechanism. They can do it at any time of the year and any time of the day. So they will lower body temperature, and when they lower body temperature, they lower heart rate, they lower their breathing, they lower their metabolism. And torpor can also be a response to stress or trauma. So I've had echidnas come in that's been rolled by a car. They are non-responsive, they roll up in a ball and won't move for days. Well, these animals have gone torpid, and best is to let them sort of alone into a cool area. Don't overheat them, because artificially increasing body temperature in a torpid echidna can also increase its stress. So going torpid is actually a way that echidnas relate to stress and also often relate to healing processes. Right, you might know other animals that go torpid. This is one of our little pygmy possums on Kangaroo Island, and every now and again I go out and I've had some little tubes on the ground, and what's is a little torpid, a little torpid pygmy possum. So there's quite a number of different species that use torpor, and torpor is an important mechanism, sometimes a life-saving mechanism for a lot of species. So echidnas, again, can go torpid at any season and any time of the day. It's not unusual to let their body temperature drop at night, sometimes as much as 10 degrees. And again, think about where you're holding your echidnas. And it's not unusual to see an echidna basking. Now, what you're seeing in this photo is not a dead echidna. This echidna had got up from its burrow. I was watching it. It walked over to this orthosanthus, laid flat down with its feet out, and was basking on a nice sunny day. And what they often do is then also raise those spines because they're raising their body temperature again. Okay, so having a variable body temperature is one of their good survival strategies. You have to remember echidnas are the longest surviving mammals in the world. Having a variable body temperature, using torpor, and having a high thermal variability has helped them survive over the last 120 million years. What's going to happen with climate change? I can hear some of you asking. Well, echidnas also live in the deserts. Like I said, they're very adaptable. The other interesting thing about echidnas is that they can tolerate very high CO2 levels. So they've been known to tolerate up to 12% of CO2 levels without actually affecting them too much. So that means they're probably going to survive a lot longer than we are. Okay, echidnas and temperature. What to remember is basically never put a rescued adult or young echidna on a hot water bottle, under a heat lamp, or anything like that. I'm not going to go into hand rearing today because I could talk again for at least an hour or three on that. But I did want to mention that the temperature in the nursery burrows, so temperatures if you are, hand rearing a young, are very important because when the female puts the young into a burrow, the burrow is usually only around 17 to 18 degrees. And even though she's still suckling it into the summertime where it can be quite hot, the maximum in the nursery burrow is 21 degrees. So again, temperature is very important for keeping the animal healthy and having it develop its natural immune systems. Okay, next on my survival triangle was food and metabolism. Now, I'm not going to go a lot into food because when an echidna has been rescued, it's not unusual for it not to eat for a week or 2 weeks. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. Echidnas can survive a long time without food. As I said, it's normal for them to go torpid because it is an energy-saving mechanism. So I always say don't fret too much. But what do they eat? They actually eat lots and lots of types of invertebrates. It's not just ants and termites. So when you have your animals, you don't ever try to feed them one thing. And normally when we try to feed an echidna, can be successful. There's different formulas, but best is when the animal gets out and finds its own food. So as I said, it's not just ants and termites. What you're seeing here is a nest from an inchant mound, which probably some of you, oh no, sorry, this is not inchants. This is the Iridomyrmex. So they are a biting ant, the meat ant, and they only have their eggs and larvae at certain times of the year. And that's when you might find these types of digs in these ant mounds, because what the echidnas are after are the eggs and the larvae. And that's going to be happening fairly soon, coming into spring. And it's especially the females that have produced an egg and are carrying a young that they want this food source that's high in fat and high in protein. So we find that they also go for a lot of grubs. This is a real typical echidna dig that you're seeing here. When echidnas dig, just because of their structure, they will actually dig sort of in a triangular motion, so you can see big piles of dirt on either side. Sometimes they might be going very deep into the soil, up to 30 centimeters, because what they're after are these big, fat, juicy grubs. Now, their mouth, of course, is way too small to eat one of these grubs. So a lot of times you might just find the empty skin. So what they do is they use that beak like a battering ram, and they will break open this and they'll slurp out that fat and protein, just like one of your thick milkshakes. And that is just the best tucker that they can have, especially if you're a lactating female. Okay, what about water? Water, if you rescue an echidna, I think is very important. It doesn't necessarily need food, but it is always good to have a water source if you have an echidna. Echidnas do go out and look for water sources themselves, as you can see here in this trough that was out in the middle of a field, or in someone's bird bath when they get really thirsty. So it is good to keep those water out for the different wildlife. The next part of the triangle is the social structure. And I'm sure that all of you have looked at the social structure of any species that you might be working with, because some animals are very social and actually need that personal touch, even from a carer, where other animals just are not social at all. And basically, that's the echidna. So echidnas are solitary, except during the breeding season. And the breeding season, we're just now coming to the end of the breeding season. And I hope some of you have maybe seen an echidna train. I could show you echidna train photos from all over Australia, but I'm only going to show the one tonight because I'm really not going into the reproduction, except to give you a series of photos of what happens during this time. So echidna trains do happen all over Australia, and there doesn't necessarily need to be 4 echidnas like you see here. It might only be 1 male with a female. It might be 10 males with a female. And the breeding or the courtship period can go on for a week, or it can go on for 4 weeks. Every season that we've looked at it has been very different. What we do know is that there's usually only one, well, as far as we know on Kangaroo Island, there is only 1 male that successfully breeds with a female when she is receptive. And for the male to breed with the female, what you're seeing here is this is a female. This is Big Mama. Known her now for, I've been here 35 years, but she was known before I came. So she's at least 45 years old and still reproductively active. What you have here is the male. If there is more than 1 male still competing for the female, the males will sort of meet each other head on head, push each other around until one gets displaced. Then the male needs to dig next to the female, and he will dig until he can place his tail under hers, which is how the actual intromission happens. And intromission is a minimum of 30 minutes and up to 2 hours. So if you see an echidna crawling on top of each other, yeah, they're not mating. Okay, so after mating, they go their separate ways. The female is no longer emitting the chemical that has attracted the males, and the males will often go out looking for another female. So one of the questions asked in the 1800s was, how does the egg get into the pouch once they knew that it was an egg-laying mammal? And it took us thousands of hours of watching echidnas to see an echidna in this sitting position. And yes, echidnas can actually sit on their butt. It is unusual to see this, but it's in this position that she lays her single egg. So she will place the cloaca directly over that pseudo pouch and lay the one single egg about 22 days after mating. So you can see the egg is a little bit, about the size of a 5-cent coin in diameter. It's very, very small. And she can carry it in the pouch and walk around with it. Okay, so the egg is in the pouch only for 10 days during incubation. And what you're seeing in this photo is actually the candling of an echidna egg, where you can actually see the developing embryo inside. As I said, echidnas do not have teeth, but the developing embryo does have an egg tooth. And this is an amazing drawing that was made by Richard Seaman in 1890. So he was able to work with Aboriginal people in the Queensland area who collected echidnas with and without eggs or puggles, and he did some of the best embryological studies we've ever had. Okay, so the weight of a hatchling echidna is only 230 to 370 milligrams. And because that's hard to imagine, this is what I always like to tell not only kids, but adults. But take a 5-cent coin in your hand and feel it. And it takes 8 newly hatched echidnas to weigh as much as a 5-cent coin. And that's, I mean, that still blows me away every time I see one. I mean, they are just absolutely amazing. Okay, so what about the pouch? The pseudo pouch. The pseudo pouch is not always there. What you're seeing in this animal is that the mammary glands have swollen. and that even though she doesn't have a teat or a nipple, she has an area called a milk patch. So when you look at any echidna outside of the breeding season, they can take that panniculus carnosus, that muscle, and pull it together, forming what looks like a tight little pouch. That is not a pouch. There is no pseudopouch until the female is actually going to lactate. It's only when she's been impregnated that the mammary glands swell, that they swell enough to form this pseudopouch where the young will then be carried. And the young actually have to hold on to the hairs of the pouch to remain in the pouch because it doesn't close, and it's not at all like a pouch of a kangaroo. So what you're seeing here is the milk patch where the young actually does suckle. It does not lick the milk, it suckles the milk. So size relationship, those are my fingers, okay, those are my fingers, and what you're seeing here is the hatchling, is the puggle. You can see here is the milk in the stomach, here's the milk patch where the young has been suckling, and you can see the front legs are well developed because they have to hold on to the hairs of mom's pouch to stay in there. Again, my finger for size relationship. You can also see that they're 24 hours old. The hind legs, the buds are just starting to develop. You'll also see that I'm not touching the young. You can see that it's very wet at this time. And this was a mystery to us for a long, long time. The pouch, the pseudo pouch is dry while she's carrying the egg. And when the egg hatches, the young only fills about 1/3 of it, and the rest is liquid. And we couldn't figure out why there was this liquid in the pouch. But it was a number of years later that another scientist was working with pygmy possums, and he postulated that any young marsupial, or in this case monotreme, that weighs less than 0.5 gram at birth would be using skin respiration for the first few days of life. So this is why, must be why, that the young is so wet, that the puggle is so wet for about the first 3 days. So all the weighing and measuring we've done with puggles at this stage has been very quick, a few seconds in the tube, weigh it back into the pouch. We've never lost one. Okay, here we are at 2 days of age. You can see it a little bit better. At this stage, they still sort of look very platypus-like, and you can see that it's still very wet. By 5 days of age, the skin has dried off completely. You can see that the beak is really starting to form. The eyes will stay closed for quite some time, and you can see the first thing it wants to do is grab onto the hairs in the pouch. The milk of the female is very interesting. In fact, the Australian Dairy Board would like to know more about how echidnas can do it because so at hatching, the young weighed 0.3 of a gram. 9 days later, you can see here on my little scale, it weighs 9 grams. So it grows at a tremendous rate. Still at this stage, not really viable for hand rearing. By 14 days of age, you can see that I can actually pick it up and handle it. And it's basically developed its hind legs, its front legs, the beak is well into development. By the time it's 35 days old, you can see that all it wants to do is hang on to something. You can see where it could pull these muscles together to form a pseudo pouch. And normally an echidna has to be about 6 years old before I can even try to decide what the gender is. But if you look very carefully down here, you can see these 4 dots, and this was a male. So this is the puggle climbing back into that pseudo pouch, and it's not going to be fully covered by the flaps of the female's pseudo pouch. And this is where, you know, it's often hanging down, and this is why it's also very vulnerable for the puggle at this stage. So at about 45 days of age, it starts to develop these little hairy bits, and it's still clinging to the hairs of mom's pouch. You can see that the eyes are closed, the ear is actually still closed, and by this time the female is actually sort of walking on tippy toes. Sometimes you'll see this around October, and this is the time when the female does dig a special nursery burrow for the young. So anytime, I usually say after 30-35 days of age is a time when puggles can usually successfully be hand reared. Okay, nursery burrow. Now this is a thing in the wild. A nursery burrow can be anywhere, And this is one of the greatest and saddest occasions, that once the female has put the young into the burrow, you're not going to find it, because she backfills the burrow, or I should say you normally aren't going to find it. You can get lucky. But she normally backfills the burrow, and she will forage over 1 kilometer sometimes away from the nursery burrow before she goes back to suckle the young. And this is when, if a female becomes a roadkill at this time, then the young will, of course, not survive. So the young is in the burrow. Now, it's been carried for about 50 days. It's in the burrow then for the next 5 months, because it's not weaned until it's about 210 days old. So, of course, one of our biggest challenges was to find out, okay, A, what's happening in the burrow, and B, of course, when does mom come back? So I've radio tracked echidnas with volunteers over many, many years. It was a challenge first to find the nursery burrows once we knew that she had a young. When we did find nursery burrows, the question was, when is she going to come back? All of you working with marsupials know how often you have to feed those young. Well, with an echidna, we found out that the female returns for 2 hours every 5 days to suckle the young. And that's it, 2 hours every 5 days. And this is sort of what a young looks like after it's been suckled. And the amazing thing is that every time the female goes to suckle her young, it will take in between 10 and 40% of its own body mass. And yeah, so it's in this very cool burrow. She wakes it up, she suckles it, she leaves it, and then what it does best is sleep. So it also goes torpid during this time. It lowers its body temperature, and it has slower metabolism. So it's going to metabolize a lot of that food, but it's going to lose a lot of that milk, and it's only going to put on a certain amount of body mass. And this is something that's very, very different than any other mammal. Okay, so young are weaned at about 7 months, and just the graph at the bottom to remind people that there are large and small individuals. So you cannot tell sort of semi-adults from adults, because we can have adult echidnas that only weigh 2.5 kilograms, and we have adult echidnas that weigh 5 kilograms. So these are all sexually mature females, and they stay at that weight for most of their life, of course, with variations seasonally. So what you see here is that a small female has weaned a small young at about 800 grams, and a large female has weaned a large young at about over 2,000 grams, and yet both of these young, when they were weaned, were 7 months old. So again, it's very difficult when you're hand rearing, and if you don't know what the female was like, you don't know if you're going to have a large or a small young when it's ready to be weaned at the right time. And so you should always remember that the weight at weaning has nothing to do with age. So the young are independent until weaning, which means that they live a solitary lifestyle until they are sexually mature, and they're not sexually mature until 6, and we've had some females who have not become sexually mature, and that meant when they produced their first young until they were 12 years old. And you have to remember, echidnas can easily live in the wild to up to 50 years. So basically, to bring this talk to an end, I know there's a lot of other things that could have been covered, but I wanted to give some basic information about what I think is important about echidnas, why they're different, why we really need to look at their temperature, and why you really need to consider what their lifestyle is, what their physiology is when you get one of these animals in care. So at the end, the survival triangle, why is it important? Well, I think it's important because what each of us want to do is make sure any animal that we have hand reared, any animal that we have rescued, can go back out into the wild and have long-term natural survival in its wild situation. So the end of this talk for me, at least today, sorry I couldn't see you all, but I always say, you know, the ultimate goal is to return an animal, whether it's rehabilitated or reared from the wild, back to the wild, and to know that you're offering it long-term natural survival. So everything we try to do with rescue, everything I try to do with hand rearing, is to do it as natural as possible. So I guess if there's any questions coming through, I'm happy to answer them. And anytime, you know, anyone wants to contact me via email, I'm happy to answer any questions if I can.